Good afternoon, everybody. As you can see, I'm standing in front of a stunning building, ladies and gentlemen. This is the entrance to the City of London Cemetery, way up in the farther end of the East End of London. Ladies and gentlemen, today's tour is all about paying respect to the victims of Jack the Ripper. Today, of course, as a Jack the Ripper tour guide, I do have a tremendous amount of empathy for these girls. I mean, Jack the Ripper was not some famed London historic East End character. These girls were daughters, they were mothers. They meant something to someone. They were victims of circumstance. And today I wanted to make it about the girls. And I wanted to take you to meet and to see their final resting places so we can pay our respects here to the victims of Jack the Ripper. Make no mistake about the impact they had on the East End. The publicity of Jack the Ripper, over 1 million newspapers were being printed on a daily basis. And it highlighted the social problems in the East End. People started to take notice that why in the richest, largest city in the world, people were living in horrendous conditions in Whitechapel. So these girls actually changed the course of history for future generations to come. A massive social reform came about as a result of the deaths of these girls. So now it's about time we pay tribute to these ladies, and let's go visit the final resting place of the canonical 5 victims of Jack the Ripper. What a beautiful entrance into this garden of rest, ladies and gentlemen, and the resting place of 2 of Jack the Ripper's victims. This is the City of London Cemetery and Crematorium, and it was opened up in 1856, and it's still managed and maintained by the City of London Corporation. So we're going to have a little look inside. Now, today is just about Jack the Ripper's victims, but I will come back and do another tour. But it's spread over 200 acres, and burials still take place in the cemetery to this day. So we've entered straight through, and this place is absolutely stunning, folks. They estimate there's over 600,000 people buried here, which is pretty remarkable. But it's a completely different vibe to the Magnificent 7. Seems a lot more kind of cultivated and manicured, if you like. But it's treated also as a kind of a garden of remembrance. And look at that beautiful grave, bless him, only 9 years old. My beloved son, Clive Milton. So this is a lot more recent graves. So I'm quite happy that this has been chosen as a resting place for 2 of Jack's victims. Some people think it's quite morbid, but it's more of a nature reserve as well, and people come here to enjoy the peace and the serenity. And this is a very peaceful, spiritual place, folks. I feel it already. There's just a sense of calm here. People are at peace or resting peacefully. To be fair, it's not a bad place to get lost in. We have to veer off from the Central Avenue. I'm ashamed to admit this is my first time visiting. Now, I have done a previous video on Elizabeth Stride, and she was the only UK victim of Jack the Ripper. She came from Gothenburg in Sweden, and I will introduce that. We will include that footage, obviously, in this tour of the graves today. Look how beautifully well kept this area is. My God, it's enormous. Really beautiful. Yes, we're heading in the right direction now. We're heading down here towards the Memorial Gardens. And that is where both of the victims. So today we're going to be talking about Mary Ann Nichols. She was the very first of Jack the Ripper's victims. She was drinking that night in the Frying Pan pub on Brick Lane. And she leaves the pub. She's wearing a beautiful new bonnet. A jolly new bonnet with a black velvet trim. She's treated herself. She thinks it's going to be good for attracting customers. She heads to her regular accommodation without the 4 pence for her stay. She knocks on the door and the landlord turns her away. Not tonight, Mary. No pay, no stay. Now, he wasn't being unreasonable, folks. She owed him a lot of money in background. She's not too concerned. She's wearing her jolly new bonnet. She said she'd be back to see him. She'd get her 4 pence and she'd return. In the meantime, she has met her best friend, Emily Holland. And Emily tries to convince her to return to the accommodation, even offering to pay her 4 pence. But she's having none of it. She said she's had her DOS money 3 times tonight. She's drunk it and she won't take her long to earn the 4th. Tells her to go back to the accommodation and she'll see you back there. But tragically, at 3:40 a.m. in an area called Bucks Row, 2 chaps happen on, Charles Cross and Robert Paul, on the body of a woman. And of course it was Marianne Nichols. Now, we won't get into the graphic details of the murder today because I think that's disrespectful. But she, unfortunately, had met her fateful end on the 31st of August, 1888. Just want to show you this beautiful feature here. Letters to Heaven. Isn't that magnificent? A little post box for people to post their little letters to heaven to their relatives. This is the nicest feature I've ever seen anyone. A bridge between 2 realms, bounded by love's embrace. How special. And this gorgeous little garden here with a water feature. Oh my God. How deserved for these 2 girls. Isn't it beautiful? I believe it's just along here, but there are so many maintenance men and gardeners. Truly is a credit to them. This amazing garden of peace and restful slumber. Can't deny this is somewhere I would feel very comfortable laid to rest. And here we have actually the grave of Martha Tabram, ladies and gents. Now, Martha, some believe, was a victim of Jack the Ripper. It has been suggested that if there was another likely victim, it was most likely Martha Tabram. And Martha met her gruesome fate in George Yard. 3 weeks, it was the 7th of August. And she had a brutal death as well, and a lot of people believe she was a victim of Jack the Ripper. It's a bone of contention actually in the Jack the Ripper community whether or not she wasn't, but either way, another girl in the East End who had fallen on hard times, ladies and gents. So I think we may be just coming up on the dedication now. There is a slight, well, it's questionable if this is the exact site of Mary Nichols' burial, but Marianne. But we do know that she was buried somewhere around this particular plot. And here is her very somber yet recognized grave here in the City of London Cemetery. How elegant and demure. Marianne's funeral took place on the 6th of September 1888, and they did try to keep it very secret because they didn't want too many, well, mourners arriving, or people that were, what do they call them, rubbernecking, or curious, morbid curiosity amongst the masses. However, their attempt to keep it under wraps failed miserably because hundreds and hundreds of mourners, thousands of them actually, lined the streets the whole way up here, and it is said over 500 mourners or 500 people were here to witness the burial of poor old sweet Marianne Nichols, or Polly. She was incredibly loved No one had a bad word to say about poor old sweet Mary Ann. So that's first of Jack the Ripper's victims here at the City of London Cemetery. People tend to leave coins as well for her, which is quite ironic considering perhaps if she had had that 4 pence that night for her accommodation, she may have lived for many, many more years. So in the exact same location, ladies and gents, here in the City of London Cemetery, we come up on the fourth victim of Jack the Ripper, poor old Catherien Eddowes. And Catherien Eddowes was the second victim on the 30th of September 1888 of what was known as the double event, where Jack the Ripper didn't strike once in a night, he struck twice. And Catherine's body was found at Mitre Square by P.C. Edward Watkins. And here lays the fourth victim of Catherine of Jack the Ripper, and she passed away on the 30th of September 1888. Catherine had a few sociable drinks that night. She was impersonating a fire engine, according to police reports. And she was taken back to the drunk tank. PC Louis Robinson had picked her up, police constable. He didn't arrest her, he knew Catherine, he knew Kate, and later on that evening, she met who we suspect now to be Jack the Ripper. And Catherine's funeral took place on the 8th of October, the Monday. The funeral was paid for by G.C. Hawkes, an undertaker, who bore the expense of her funeral, much to the gratitude of her family. Now, her funeral again was thousands lined the streets to see her coffin paraded through. Graciously as well, the cemetery waived all costs for her burial, and it was attended by her longtime partner, John Kelly, and 4 of her sisters. And Catherine buried so close to Mary Ann Nichols. And this is the beautiful City of London Cemetery in Manor Park. So we'll make our way back up to the entrance. Next up, the graveyard of Annie Chapman, the second victim of Jack the Ripper, and the eldest of his victims at 48 years of age. So I've just returned back to Manor Park Station. And just right beside it is a street called Witter Road. And that takes us into the back entrance of Manor Park Cemetery and Crematorium. So this is where Annie Chapman, the eldest of Jack the Ripper's victims, was buried. She was 48 years of age. Annie breaks my heart because Annie was dying of tuberculosis. So even when they did the post-mortem examination on her body, they suggested she wouldn't have had any more than 3 weeks to live. So if Jack the Ripper hadn't brutally murdered her folks, the streets of Whitechapel were coming very close. But again, Annie had no money for accommodation that night, and her landlord heartlessly turfed her out on the street. She was spotted speaking to a gentleman at 29 Hanbury Street, and her body was found regretfully at the back courtyard of 29 Hanbury Street on the 8th of September 1888. I will, darling. I just met a lovely chap there. He's just instructed me exactly where she is. So, in fact, the back entrance is probably the most convenient because she's laid to rest right up here. Poor old Annie. So Annie is laid to rest right here by these orange flowers. So this is a plaque that they've put and dedicated to her memory. But they've also installed a headstone for her, which is remarkable because it's hard to know, because a lot of these girls were buried in paupers' graves. So the plots would have had multiple burials. So we know it's in or around this immediate area. And it's wonderful that they've already done a beautiful headstone for her here as well, which shows how she was a tragic victim, it says, of Jack the Ripper, and she's laid to rest within this area. May she rest in peace. And that's quite commonplace as well, where people leave little stones just to say that they have visited. And Annie Chapman at 150, the resting place and the plaque that was put up for her. But her funeral, much to the joy of the family, they maintained great secrecy on the day. And she was laid to rest on the 14th of September. The private funeral for Annie was, all expenses were paid by her relatives. And the fixed time of the ceremony, because of their need for privacy, was kept exclusively only known to the relatives of the deceased and the undertaker, Mr. A. Hawes. So her body was picked up at the morgue at 7 a.m. on Montague Street, and this is where she was laid to rest. The second victim of Jack the Ripper. Rest in peace, Annie Chapman. And just as you enter the cemetery, it gives you quite a bit of history of some of the more famous historic routes here in the cemetery, including Annie Chapman's grave. You have Mary Orchard, who was for 40 years nanny to the children of Princess Alice, daughter of Queen Victoria, married the Grand Duke of Hesse. You also have a memorial to the Bethnal Green tube disaster. Tragically, 173 people were crushed to death. I speak about that quite solemnly on our Haunted Tube tour, ladies and gents, so that's worth having a look as well. And there is a civilian war memorial. Remains of 57 people killed during a Luftwaffe bombing and raid during the Second World War. And Francis Albemarle McDougall, it says here, was one of numerous London residents who fought in the American Civil War. So, quite an interesting place, ladies and gents. Beautiful Manor Park Cemetery. Now, this cemetery was built to accommodate the growing populations of East London, of course, and the increasing demands for a cemetery in the eastern suburbs. So there's 33 acres in this cemetery, and as you can see, it's a fully working cemetery. Now, there are two Gothic 19th century chapels that remain as well in this graveyard. They're quite pretty. We might see them along the way, but as I say, this is not so much a cemetery tour as a little walk up to the grave of Elizabeth Stride. Inside here, there's a couple of separate memorials as well. There's a memorial to the 550 victims of the 1878 Princess Alice disaster. I'm mentioning this because this sunk in the River Thames and has a little connection to Elizabeth Stride in a few minutes, or what Elizabeth Stride told people. Sylvia Coleridge is buried in here, Beryl Cook is buried in here, and I suppose one of the most notable is Carl Hans Lodi. He was executed in the Tower of London on the 6th of November in 1914. Technically, he was the first person to be shot during World War I in the Tower of London. A German spy, he's also buried here under his own black headstone. There are 10 other German spies buried here that were shot in World War I under their own separate memorial. But we're going to take a little journey down here. Now, Elizabeth Stride, originally from Gothenburg in Sweden, when she moved here, she married a local chap. His name was John Stride. And for several years, they lived quite modestly, but in no way impoverished at the time. They ran a coffee shop in the East End in Poplar, and John Stride also was a qualified carpenter, so their income was supplemented from his carpenter work as well. But by 1874, there were signs that the marriage was deteriorating because there were records of Elizabeth Stride registering herself into the Poplar workhouse, suggesting that she had left him roughly by about 1877. But people tend to think that they were in a kind of an on and off again relationship. That is, of course, until he died in 1884 of tuberculosis. But that fateful evening, her body was discovered by Louis Deemschutz, and that was in Duffield's yard. She was buried here. She actually, for several years after her husband's death, I forgot to mention this, had said her husband and 2 of her 9 children had died on the Princess Alice disaster, but there's actually no records of that ever occurring. And we believe she was receiving some financial aid as a result of that disaster, and she lost that. So she was working the streets of Whitechapel that night. But she also did a lot of work as a housekeeper and a seamstress. So technically she was part-time. But it is quite emotional for me personally as well to speak so much about these girls and their lives. And I think their legacy is that the publicity of the Jack the Ripper murders highlighted the massive social inequality and the horrendous slums of Whitechapel in the press all over the world. And social reform did come about as a result of the deaths of these girls. As you'll see here, her very modest grave. We know she is physically buried here. A lot of the other girls' graves are actually just memorials or signs of them. They're paupers' graves, or they tended to be quite... paupers' graves had a lot of multiple burials in them, but this is the gravesite of Elizabeth Stride. Now, her funeral took place here on Saturday the 6th of October. And it was a very small funeral attended by very few people, but she does have quite a few visitors to the gravesite here. A lot of my colleagues will come here on the anniversary of her death to pay their respects. I believe the funeral expenses at that time were covered by the parish and provided by the undertaker, Mr. Hawkes, at the time. So a rather sombre memorial to one of the victims of Jack the Ripper. Now, you might have heard a bit of rustling there. I did bring a lily and I want to lay that down. I hope I haven't damaged it. Excuse me for 1 second. And we'll just leave it there, maybe in the middle of the cherub. This is a, pay my respects too. It's only a small little token. But there you have it, ladies and gents. In infamous history, may she rest in peace, one of the canonical 5. And her legacy, as I said, and the legacy of all these ladies, wasn't so much their deaths as how they have contributed to massive social reform that took place as a result of the deaths of these girls and the publicity of them all over the world. May Elizabeth Stride's gentle soul rest in peace. And that's grave of Elizabeth Stride, one of the canonical 5. So our last destination today, ladies and gents, takes us up here to Leytonstone. Now, this is a bit further up on the tube past Stratford, so it's more East London than the rest. And we're heading into St. Patrick's Roman Catholic Cemetery here in Leytonstone, and we're going to talk a little bit about the funeral of the final victim of Jack the Ripper. Now, immediately as you come in, you see the beautiful chapel. This is a Roman Catholic cemetery. Now, Mary Jane Kelly, not an awful lot is known about her, and in fact, on the day of her funeral, they found it quite difficult to trace her relatives. So we're facing with quite a few more recent graves as well. 1978. There's one in 1902. It's a beautiful, beautiful cemetery. Oh, wow. The amount of statues. So I've just met this lovely gentleman that works here, you guys. He's going to show me exactly where Mary Jane Kelly's is. But this grave, interestingly enough, we were just talking about there, Jane Gillett, its grave now. But the previous grave here was of John McCarthy, Mary Jane Kelly's landlord. And of course, it's because she owed him money that night that she arranged to meet a client inside of the accommodation. And John McCarthy sent his muscle, an ex-military man by the name of Thomas Boyer, around to the address that morning to retrieve the 29 shillings she owed. Quite fascinating, considering that would have been the grave of Mary Jane Kelly's landlord. If only she hadn't owed him money, maybe she would have lived for a few more years. So if you just walk along that path past the church and turn up here onto the right, ladies and gents, we come across the headstone and the little grave that's dedicated to Mary Jane Kelly, the final victim of Jack the Ripper. Now, not a lot is known actually about Mary Jane Kelly's ancestry, but we do know she was an Irish girl from County Limerick and she had relatives in Wales, and her funeral had been postponed because originally they were waiting for family members to come to pay their respects. But unfortunately, nobody on the day showed up, but it was more than compensated for with the thousands of people that showed up just outside Shoreditch Morgue, where she was taken to. And at 12 noon, outside St. Leonard's Church, when the bells tolled at noon, it gathered several thousand mourners, ladies and gents, an emotional crowd all there to see Mary Jane Kelly's coffin being transferred to the hearse. Now, placed on Mary Jane's coffin were 2 crowns of artificial flowers and a cross made of heart's ease, and that had been donated from the residents of Miller's Court. Well, the street she lived on was Dorset Street. So again, despite no family member being able to attend, the funeral was also preceded by 2 mourning coaches, and inside one of them was her on and off again boyfriend, Joseph Barnett. Upon arrival, her casket was met here by the Reverend Columbine, and she was laid to rest at this very spot on the 19th of November. But as popular and as loved as she was, there was nobody to pay her funeral. So it just shows you these amazing stories of humanity. So Henry Wilton, who was the undertaker for St. Leonard's in Shoreditch, he was determined she wouldn't lie in a pauper's grave. So the entire cost of the funeral and burial was borne by him himself. What a wonderful man. Now, it's quite interesting. I was talking to the gentleman as we were walking around, and he said the amount of people that visit Mary Jane Kelly's grave. He recently had a guy from South America who flew in, took a taxi straight to her grave, and flew back again and left a donation. Now, there's donations. We'll see if we can find the links to these cemeteries, because a lot of people leave donations in the pot. So for the regular upkeep of these graves and these plaques, and fresh flowers can be put on them for the victims of Jack the Ripper. And it's also important to note that these girls, as I said previously, well, they were daughters, they were mothers, and bless them, they were victims of circumstance. So I hope you enjoyed this, ladies and gents. It is important to pay respects to these lovely girls and the victims of 1888 and the Autumn of Terror. Stay tuned. I have another haunted series coming up to finish off our month of October. But thanks as ever for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe and share, my lovelies. It really does help, and any comments I would be really appreciative of. That's really great for analytics as well. And of course, the buy me a coffee is there if you'd like to buy me a gin or a cup of coffee. But I've seen a lot of you on recent tours. One little gentleman has asked me to shout out to him. So big hello to Diego. And for anyone that's on my tours, delighted to have met you all in the last few weeks. And hopefully we'll see a lot more of you in the near future. So Sinead signing out here at St. Patrick's Roman Catholic Cemetery in Leytonstone in London. Thanks for watching as always, folks. See you soon.